Chen Wang hurried through the bustling terminal of Pacific International Airport, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her crisp airline uniform. She was running late for her shift, and being late wasn't something she could afford, not when she was still on probation during her first 3 months as a flight attendant with Sky Global Airlines. The morning had started badly when her car wouldn't start, forcing her to take an expensive rideshare to the airport. Now, with just 20 minutes until the pre-flight briefing, she was practically jogging through the staff security checkpoint. "Good morning, Chen," called out Ray, the elderly security guard who had become familiar with her morning rushes. "Cutting it close again?" "Don't remind me," she replied, forcing a smile while quickly removing her shoes for the scanner. "My car picked the worst day to give up on me." As Chen rushed to the crew room, she couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and anxiety. Being a flight attendant had been her dream since childhood, watching planes take off from her bedroom window near the airport. But lately, the job wasn't quite what she had imagined. The glamour she'd expected was overshadowed by demanding passengers, long hours, and a constant pressure to maintain a perfect appearance and attitude. The crew briefing went by in a blur of safety procedures and passenger manifests. Today's flight was headed to Dubai, and the first-class cabin was fully booked, always a challenge for new flight attendants who were expected to provide impeccable service to the airline's most valuable customers. "Chen, you'll be handling first class today," announced Raj, the senior cabin crew member. "Lisa called in sick, and you're the only one certified for premium service who isn't already assigned." Chen's stomach dropped. First class? On a long-haul flight to Dubai? She had only worked in first class twice before, on short domestic routes. But she couldn't show her nervousness, not when she was still trying to prove herself worthy of her position. As passengers began boarding, Chen took her position at the entrance, greeting everyone with a practiced smile. The first-class cabin filled quickly with the usual mix of business executives and wealthy travelers, all expecting the exceptional service they had paid for. Then came the moment that would change everything. A family of 4 approached, a middle-aged couple with 2 teenage children. They were dressed casually, perhaps too casually for first class, in Chen's opinion. The father wore a simple black t-shirt and jeans, while the mother had on a comfortable tracksuit. The teenagers were similarly dressed in hoodies and sneakers. Chen checked their boarding passes, and something didn't seem right. "Excuse me, but these passes show economy class," she said, maintaining her professional tone. "This is the first-class cabin." The father smiled kindly. "There must be some mistake. We're supposed to be in first class." Chen felt the weight of her training manual's rules pressing down on her. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'll need to see the correct boarding passes." Perhaps there was a mix-up at check-in? The mother stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "We were upgraded by the airline. Could you please double-check your passenger list?" Chen glanced at her manifest. There was indeed a family of 4 listed, but the name didn't match what she saw on their economy boarding passes. In her mind, this had to be a mistake, or worse, passengers trying to sneak into first class, something she'd been warned about during training. "I apologize, but I'll need to ask you to proceed to your assigned seats in economy," Chen insisted, her voice growing firmer. A line was forming behind the family, and she could feel the impatient stares of other passengers. The father pulled out his phone. "Let me call someone to sort this out." "Sir, we're about to close the doors. I'm afraid you'll need to move to your assigned seats now, or we'll have to delay the flight," Chen said, her anxiety rising. She couldn't delay the flight, not during her probation period. What Chen didn't know was that the man reaching for his phone was Mr. Daniel Lee, one of the largest shareholders of Sky Global Airlines. The family's casual appearance was the result of a last-minute flight change after attending a charity event in the city. The upgrade had been processed directly by the airline's executive office, but due to a computer glitch, their boarding passes hadn't been updated. As Chen stood her ground, insisting they move to economy, other crew members began to notice the commotion. Raj, the senior crew member, was making his way up from the back of the plane. The teenagers exchanged knowing looks with their parents, remaining surprisingly calm despite the embarrassing situation. They had been through similar scenarios before. People often underestimated their family based on appearances. Mrs. Lee placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm. "Perhaps we should just take our economy seats for now," she suggested, though her eyes showed a hint of disappointment. They had planned to use the long flight to Dubai to discuss their children's upcoming university plans in the comfort of first class. Chen felt a surge of satisfaction. She was doing her job, maintaining order, following procedures. Yet something about the family's quiet dignity made her uncomfortable. They weren't arguing or making a scene like most passengers would in this situation. Just then, Raj arrived, slightly out of breath. "Is there a problem here?" Before Chen could explain, her phone buzzed with an urgent message from the ground crew. Her heart nearly stopped as she read it. "VIP alert, Lee family boarding first class, CEO's office upgrade confirmation attached." The color drained from Chen's face as she realized her mistake. She looked up to find Mr. Lee already showing Raj his identification and a digital copy of the upgrade confirmation. Raj's expression shifted from concern to shock to professional panic in seconds. "Mr. Lee, Mrs. Lee, please accept our sincerest apologies for this misunderstanding. Of course, your first-class seats are ready for you." Chen stood frozen, her perfect world crumbling around her. Not only had she questioned the legitimacy of their upgrade, but she had also nearly forced one of the airline's most important families to sit in economy due to her rigid adherence to rules without properly investigating the situation. As the Lee family was finally settled into their correct seats, Chen's hands trembled while serving them their welcome drinks. Mr. Lee accepted his sparkling water with the same kind smile he had shown earlier, but Chen could hardly meet his eyes. The flight was departing in minutes, and Chen knew this incident would be reported. Her dream job, barely 3 months in, might be over before it truly began. As she prepared for takeoff, she couldn't help but wonder how such a simple assumption about appearance had led to such a massive mistake. Little did Chen know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would teach her, and everyone involved, valuable lessons about judgment, humility, and the unexpected ways life can turn around even our worst moments. The first hour of the flight to Dubai felt like the longest hour of Chen's life. Every time she passed through the first-class cabin, she could feel the weight of her mistake pressing down on her shoulders. The Lee family, however, showed no signs of anger or resentment. If anything, their gracious behavior made her feel even worse. During the meal service, Chen noticed that Mrs. Lee was particularly kind to her, thanking her warmly for every small gesture. The two teenagers, a boy and a girl, were immersed in their books, occasionally looking up to give her polite smiles. Their behavior was far from what Chen had expected from a billionaire's children. As Chen prepared the appetizers in the galley, Raj pulled her aside. "Ground control just contacted us," he whispered. "Mr. Lee isn't just a shareholder, he owns 30% of Sky Global Airlines. He's on the board of directors." Chen's hands shook so badly that she nearly dropped the tray she was holding. "What's going to happen to me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Raj's expression softened. "Look, I've been flying for 15 years. The best thing you can do right now is provide exceptional service and show them you're better than that initial mistake." Taking a deep breath, Chen returned to the cabin with the appetizers. As she served Mr. Lee, she gathered her courage. "Sir, I wanted to sincerely apologize for the confusion earlier. My behavior was unprofessional, and I'm truly sorry." Mr. Lee looked up from his laptop, his eyes kind but tired. "You know," he said quietly, 25 years ago, I was denied entry to my own company's building because the security guard didn't believe I was the owner. I was wearing old jeans and a t-shirt because I'd been helping move furniture into our first office." Chen paused, surprised by his response. Mr. Lee continued, "Sometimes our biggest mistakes become our greatest learning moments. Don't you agree?" Before Chen could respond, the plane encountered unexpected turbulence. The aircraft shuddered, and Chen instinctively steadied herself against the seat. Warning lights flashed, and Captain Wang's voice came over the intercom, "All cabin crew, please take your seats immediately." The turbulence grew worse, and Chen could hear worried murmurs from the passengers. She quickly secured the meal carts and made her way to her jump seat, but not before noticing how calm the Lee family remained. Mrs. Lee was comforting an elderly passenger across the aisle who seemed distressed by the rough flight. After 20 tense minutes, the turbulence subsided, but Captain Wang announced they would need to make an unscheduled landing in Mumbai due to a technical issue that required immediate attention. Chen could sense the frustration building among the passengers, particularly in first class, where many had tight schedules to maintain. As they began their descent into Mumbai, Chen overheard snippets of conversation between Mr. Lee and his children. Rather than complaining about the delay, he was using it as a teaching moment, explaining how aviation safety protocols worked and why unscheduled landings were sometimes necessary. The landing in Mumbai was smooth, but the news wasn't good. The technical issue would require several hours to resolve, and all passengers would need to deplane. The Mumbai airport was crowded, and the ground staff seemed overwhelmed by the sudden arrival of a full aircraft of displaced passengers. Chen watched in amazement as Mr. Lee quietly spoke with his family before approaching the harried ground staff. Instead of throwing his weight around as an airline owner, he began helping them organize the passengers, using his fluent Hindi to communicate with both staff and travelers. Mrs. Lee and her children joined in, helping elderly passengers with their bags and entertaining young children who were getting restless. Their actions seemed to have a ripple effect, other passengers began helping each other, and the tension in the terminal noticeably decreased. During this time, Chen and the other crew members were busy coordinating with ground staff about meal vouchers and potential hotel arrangements. She couldn't help but notice how the Lee family's presence had transformed what could have been a chaotic situation into a more manageable one. After 2 hours, Chen found herself sitting alone in the crew rest area, exhausted and worried about her future. To her surprise, Mrs. Lee approached her with 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you could use this," Mrs. Lee said, offering her one of the cups. "It's been a challenging day for everyone." Chen accepted the coffee, fighting back tears. "Why are you being so kind to me? After how I treated your family?" Mrs. Lee sat down beside her. "You know, when my husband and I first started dating, he was already successful, but he never showed it. He drove an old car and wore simple clothes. I was a waitress then, and my coworkers used to tease me about my poor boyfriend." She laughed softly at the memory. The day they found out who he really was, they were mortified. "But you know what he did? He started coming to the restaurant more often, learning everyone's names, helping out during rush hours. He turned their embarrassment into friendship." Chen listened intently as Mrs. Lee continued, "In our family, we believe that how you treat people who make mistakes says more about you than how you treat people who praise you." Their conversation was interrupted by an announcement. The technical issue had been resolved, and boarding would begin shortly. As passengers began lining up, Chen noticed something remarkable. Despite the long delay, people seemed calmer, more patient. The Lee family's earlier example had somehow shifted the entire atmosphere. Back on the plane, Chen approached her duties with renewed energy. She had learned more about leadership and grace in the past few hours than in all her training sessions combined. As she served the resumed meal service, she noticed Mr. Lee discreetly helping another passenger connect to the plane's Wi-Fi, while his children shared their tablets with 2 young kids who had run out of entertainment. The lesson was clear: true class had nothing to do with the cabin you sat in or the clothes you wore. It was about how you treated others, especially in difficult situations. As the flight continued toward Dubai, Chen realized that what had started as potentially the worst day of her career had transformed into something entirely different. She had been given a masterclass in humility, leadership, and the power of turning challenging situations into opportunities for growth. Little did she know, the most surprising part of her story was yet to unfold, and the Lee family would play an even more unexpected role in her future. The flight landed in Dubai well past midnight, nearly 6 hours behind schedule. As passengers disembarked, Chen noticed Mr. Lee speaking quietly with Raj near the cockpit. Her stomach tightened. Surely they were discussing her mistake and planning her termination. To her surprise, Mr. Lee approached her before leaving. "Would you have dinner with our family tomorrow evening? We'd love to continue our conversation." He handed her a business card with a handwritten note on the back. Before Chen could process what was happening, the Lee family had disappeared into the terminal, leaving her stunned. Back at the crew hotel, Chen couldn't sleep. She kept turning the business card over in her hands, reading the elegant handwriting that specified a time and place, the renowned Al Mahara restaurant. Her roommate, Priya, another flight attendant, watched her with growing curiosity. "You're telling me the owner of Sky Global Airlines invited you to dinner?" Priya sat cross-legged on her bed, amazed. "After what happened during boarding? This has to be good news, right?" Chen wasn't so sure. "Maybe they want to fire me in person," she said glumly, falling back onto her pillows. The next evening, Chen stood outside Al Mahara, wearing the nicest dress she'd packed for her layover. The restaurant was located inside the famous Burj Al Arab, and she felt out of place among the luxury cars pulling up to the entrance. To her surprise, Mrs. Lee was waiting for her in the lobby. "We're so glad you could join us," she said warmly, leading Chen to a private dining room with a massive aquarium wall. Mr. Lee and their children stood to greet her. "Before we begin," Mr. Lee said once they were seated, "I want you to know that this isn't about your job. You're not being fired. In fact, quite the opposite." Chen nearly choked on her water. "I'm sorry, what?" "Yesterday's flight showed us something special," Mrs. Lee explained. "Not just how you handled your mistake, but how you conducted yourself during the emergency landing. We watched you help that elderly couple with their medications, and how you kept the children calm during the turbulence." The Lee's daughter spoke up. "And we saw you give your food voucher to that student who lost his wallet during the chaos in Mumbai." Chen blushed. She hadn't realized anyone had noticed these small gestures. "You see," Mr. Lee continued, "our airline is launching a new training program. We're calling it the Human First Initiative. It's designed to teach our staff that while procedures are important, understanding human nature and showing compassion are equally crucial." He paused as their appetizers arrived. "What happened yesterday, your initial judgment of us based on our appearance, followed by how you handled the aftermath, it perfectly illustrates why this program is needed. And we'd like you to be part of developing it." Chen stared at him, confused. "But I'm the one who made the mistake. I'm still on probation." "Exactly," Mrs. Lee smiled. "Who better to help design a training program about overcoming bias and learning from mistakes than someone who has experienced it firsthand? Someone who showed grace under pressure and learned from the experience in real time?" The conversation flowed naturally after that revelation. Chen learned that the Lee children were involved in the family's charitable foundation, which focused on education and breaking down social barriers. The family's casual dress wasn't just comfort, it was a conscious choice to stay grounded despite their wealth. As they enjoyed their main course, Mr. Lee shared more about his vision for the airline. "We're not just in the transportation business," he explained. "We're in the people business. Every flight is a collection of human stories, celebrations, reunions, emergencies, dreams. Our staff needs to understand that." "But what about rules and procedures?" Chen asked, thinking about her training manual. "Rules exist to serve people, not the other way around," Mrs. Lee responded. "Yesterday, you followed the rules perfectly at first, but then you showed us something more valuable, the ability to learn, adapt, and show genuine care for others during a crisis. The Lee's son, who had been quiet most of the evening, suddenly spoke up. "Dad, tell her about Uncle Kai." Mr. Lee's eyes twinkled. "Ah, yes. My brother Kai was actually denied boarding on our own airline once, very similar to what happened yesterday. The gate agent didn't believe he was related to the owner. You know what he did? He bought coffee for everyone working that counter and spent an hour learning about their jobs. Now he runs our customer service department." As the evening drew to a close, Mr. Lee handed Chen an envelope. "This is a formal invitation to join our training development team. You'll keep flying, we want you to stay connected to our passengers, but you'll also help shape how we train our future staff." Chen opened the envelope with trembling hands. The opportunity was beyond anything she could have imagined when she woke up yesterday morning, rushing to work with a broken-down car. "Why me?" she finally asked. "There must be more qualified people." Mrs. Lee reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Because you showed us something rare, the ability to admit a mistake, learn from it immediately, and then rise above it to help others. That's exactly what we want to teach." As they stood to leave, Mr. Lee had one more surprise. "Oh, and Chen? About your car, there's a car service arranged for you during your layovers from now on. Consider it part of your new role." Outside the restaurant, as Chen waited for her taxi, she reflected on how drastically her life had changed in just 36 hours. From nearly losing her job to being offered a role in shaping the airline's future, all because she had learned the right lessons from her mistake. What she didn't know was that this dinner was just the beginning of a series of events that would not only transform her career but also impact thousands of airline employees and passengers around the world. 3 months after the fateful Dubai flight, Chen stood in front of a mirror in Sky Global Airlines corporate headquarters in Singapore, adjusting her presentation outfit. Today, she would present the first draft of the Human First training program to the airline's executive board. The past months had been a whirlwind. While maintaining her regular flight schedule, she had spent every spare moment working with a team of training specialists, psychologists, and veteran crew members to develop the new program. Her small apartment had become a maze of sticky notes and research papers. "Ready?" asked Dr. Ling, the airline's chief of staff training, as she poked her head into the preparation room. "They're all waiting." Chen gathered her materials, remembering Mrs. Lee's words from their many video calls during the program's development: "Share from your heart, not just your head." The boardroom was intimidating, all glass and steel, with panoramic views of Singapore's skyline. 15 executives sat around the massive table, including Mr. Lee, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Good morning," Chen began, her voice steadier than she felt. 3 months ago, I was the flight attendant who nearly denied boarding to the Lee family because they didn't fit my preconceived image of first-class passengers. Today, I'm here to share how that mistake has helped us create something revolutionary." She clicked to her first slide, a photo of the Mumbai airport during their emergency landing. "This crisis taught us that true luxury isn't about designer clothes or expensive tickets. It's about how we treat each other, especially during difficult moments." The presentation flowed naturally as Chen shared the program's key components: experiential learning modules where staff would encounter unexpected situations, mindfulness training to combat snap judgments, and real-world scenarios drawn from actual passenger experiences. "We've developed a concept called the invisible story," Chen explained. "Every passenger carries one, the business owner wearing sweats because she was up all night with a sick child, the elderly man in first class who saved for years to visit his grandchildren, the celebrity in economy who just wants to be treated normally." As she spoke, Chen could see the executives leaning forward, engaged. Even those who had initially seemed skeptical were now taking notes. Then came the questions. "How do we balance this human-centered approach with efficiency?" asked one executive. Chen was prepared. Our research shows that taking an extra moment to understand a passenger's situation actually saves time by preventing escalations and complaints. In the Mumbai incident, the Lee family's approach turned a potential PR disaster into a bonding experience for everyone on board. Another executive raised concerns about cost. Chen pulled up a slide showing customer satisfaction metrics. When we tested these methods on select routes, complaint rates dropped by 40%, and positive feedback increased by 60%. Happy passengers become loyal customers. Mr. Lee had remained silent throughout, but now he spoke up. Tell them about the mentorship component, Chen. Chen brightened. This was her favorite part of the program. We're pairing every new hire with a passenger who has a unique perspective. CEOs will mentor flight attendants, frequent flyers will share insights with ground staff, and most importantly, passengers who have faced discrimination will help us understand their experiences. She clicked to a video compilation, passengers sharing stories of times they were judged or mistreated during air travel. The room fell silent as they watched. This isn't just about avoiding mistakes, Chen concluded. It's about transforming our airline into a place where every person, staff or passenger, feels seen, respected, and valued. The presentation ended, and Chen held her breath. The room was quiet for a moment before erupting in applause. Mr. Lee stood up first, followed by the rest of the board. Implementation begins next month, he announced. Chen, you'll oversee the rollout across all our Asian routes first, then globally. As the executives filed out, many stopping to congratulate her, Chen felt a tap on her shoulder. It was Mrs. Lee, who had slipped in during the presentation. Remember when you thought we invited you to dinner to fire you? She smiled. Look at you now. Later that evening, Chen found herself in the staff cafeteria, still processing the day's events. A young custodian was struggling with a heavy trash bag, and Chen immediately jumped up to help him. Thank you, he said, surprised. Most people in nice suits don't notice us. Chen smiled, thinking of her presentation. Everyone has an invisible story. What's yours? The young man hesitated, then shared that he was working night shifts while studying aerospace engineering during the day. His dream was to become an aircraft designer. Pulling out her business card, Chen wrote a note on the back, just as Mr. Lee had done for her that night in Dubai. Let me introduce you to some people in our engineering department, she said. As she walked home that evening, Chen realized that the Human First program had already changed her in profound ways. She no longer saw just passengers or colleagues, she saw stories waiting to be discovered, dreams waiting to be supported. Her phone buzzed with a message from Mr. Lee. The board approved an expanded budget for the program. They want to fast-track the global rollout. You've started something big, Chen. She smiled, remembering how close she had come to losing it all because of a hasty judgment. Now she was helping to reshape one of the world's largest airlines, proving that sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest opportunities for change. But even as she celebrated this victory, Chen had no idea that her program was about to face its biggest test yet, one that would challenge everything she had learned and taught others. 6 months into the Human First program rollout, Chen sat in her new office at Sky Global Airlines Training Center, reviewing feedback from the latest batch of graduates. The wall behind her desk displayed photos from training sessions around Asia, flight attendants role-playing challenging scenarios, ground staff practicing empathy exercises, and crew members sharing their own stories of learning and growth. Her phone lit up with an urgent message from Operations Control. A major typhoon was approaching Southeast Asia, threatening to disrupt hundreds of flights. As she hurried to the Crisis Management Center, Chen couldn't help but think that this would be the first real test of her training program on a large scale. The operations room was buzzing with activity. Screens displayed weather patterns, flight routes, and endless rows of scheduling data. Mr. Lee was already there, deep in discussion with the operations team. Chen, good timing, he called out. We need to divert 37 flights and accommodate over 8,000 passengers. This is where your program proves its worth. The next few hours were intense. Chen worked with the team to implement what they called the compassion protocol, a new system that prioritized not just logistics but human needs. Instead of simply rebooking passengers on the next available flights, they considered factors like family groups, medical needs, and connecting journeys. "Sir," a junior staff member called out, "we have a group of elderly passengers scheduled for flight SG-401 to Tokyo. They're a tour group from a rural village, first time traveling abroad. Most don't speak English. In the old days, they would have been treated like any other passengers." But Chen's training had emphasized looking beyond the surface. "Find out if any of our ground staff speak their dialect," she suggested. "And let's keep them together during rebooking." As the crisis unfolded, something remarkable happened. Stories began flowing in from various airports. Staff members who had gone through the Human First training were taking initiative in unexpected ways. In Bangkok, a ground crew member had transformed a waiting area into a makeshift playground for stranded children. In Manila, flight attendants were offering basic language lessons to help passengers communicate better. In Hong Kong, a maintenance crew had rigged up charging stations for passengers' phones using their workshop equipment. Mr. Lee watched all this with quiet satisfaction. "You've created something special here, Chen. They're not just following procedures, they're thinking with their hearts." But then came the real challenge. A flight carrying a critically ill child to a specialist hospital in Singapore needed to land immediately. The nearest airport was already overcrowded with diverted flights. "The airport is saying they're at capacity," reported an operations officer. "They can't take any more diversions." Chen remembered a lesson from her own experience: sometimes rules needed to bend for humanity. She quickly pulled up the passenger manifest and found the family's details. "Get me the airport director," she requested. Instead of pulling rank or making demands, she shared the child's story with the director, painting a picture of the family's journey in their desperate need for help. Within minutes, the airport found a way to accommodate the flight. They even arranged for a medical team to be on standby during the landing. As the night wore on, Chen noticed something extraordinary. Passengers who would normally be angry about delays were sharing food and stories. A businessman offered his hotel room to a family with young children. A famous pop star, stranded in Manila, gave an impromptu concert in the terminal. "Your training didn't just change our staff," Mrs. Lee observed, having arrived to help coordinate relief efforts. "It's changing how passengers treat each other too." Around midnight, Chen received a video from a staff member in Bangkok. The elderly tour group she had worried about was teaching young passengers traditional songs, while airport staff joined in with impromptu translations. The terminal had turned into a cross-cultural celebration. "You know what's remarkable?" Mr. Lee said, watching the video. "A year ago, this crisis would have been about numbers: how many flights delayed, how much revenue lost. Now look at what's happening. We're turning an operational nightmare into a human experience." Dawn approached, and the typhoon began to weaken. As flights resumed their normal schedules, messages poured in from around the network. Stories of kindness, patience, and understanding filled Chen's inbox. A particularly touching note came from a ground staff member in Manila. "Today, I understood what you taught us about invisible stories. Every passenger I helped had one. The businessman rushing to his daughter's graduation. The elderly lady carrying her husband's ashes home. The student traveling to his first job interview. Your training helped me see them as people, not problems." Chen printed this note and pinned it to her office wall. It would serve as a reminder of what they had achieved and what was still possible. Later that week, during the crisis debrief, the airline's senior management reviewed the numbers. Despite the massive disruption, customer satisfaction scores had actually increased. The story of how Sky Global handled the typhoon crisis was making headlines, not for the chaos, but for the humanity shown. But as Chen left the office that evening, she spotted a cleaning lady struggling with her equipment. Stopping to help, she asked about the woman's day. "You know," the cleaner said, "since your program started, people look me in the eye when they pass. They say thank you. Small things, but they make me feel human." Chen realized then that the true success of Human First couldn't be measured in statistics or headlines. It was in these small moments, these tiny transformations that were happening thousands of times a day across the airline's network. What she didn't know was that the biggest challenge to her program was just around the corner, one that would test not just the airline's new philosophy but Chen's own commitment to its principles. 1 year after the implementation of Human First, Chen arrived at work to find an unusual level of tension in the air. The morning news had broken a story that would test everything she had built. Sky Global Airlines was in talks to acquire its struggling competitor, Pacific Air. The merger would make Sky Global the largest airline in Asia, but it also meant absorbing Pacific Air's 40,000 employees, staff who were known for their rigid, efficiency-first approach that often led to passenger complaints. "Have you seen their customer satisfaction ratings?" Dr. Ling asked, dropping a thick report on Chen's desk. "They're everything we've trained our staff not to be." Chen spent the morning reviewing Pacific Air's service records. Complaints about rude staff, inflexible policies, and a lack of empathy filled page after page. Their training focused solely on procedures and efficiency, with no consideration for the human element that had become Sky Global's trademark. Mr. Lee called an emergency meeting of the integration team. "We're not just buying planes and routes," he explained to the gathered executives. "We're inheriting a company culture that's the opposite of what we've built. Chen, this is where your program faces its biggest challenge." The task seemed overwhelming. Pacific Air's employees were defensive, afraid of losing their jobs, and skeptical of Sky Global's soft approach to customer service. Many saw Human First as a threat to their way of working. Chen decided to start by visiting Pacific Air's main hub in Hong Kong. Walking through their terminal, she noticed the differences immediately. Staff moved with mechanical efficiency, barely making eye contact with passengers. The atmosphere was cold, clinical. During her observation, she witnessed a scene that crystallized the challenge ahead. A Pacific Air gate agent was arguing with a passenger about excess baggage fees. The agent was technically correct, but her rigid enforcement of rules had reduced the passenger, a mother traveling with 2 small children, to tears. Chen approached quietly, introducing herself to both parties. Instead of immediately taking sides, she listened to both stories. The mother was moving countries after a divorce, trying to carry precious memories for her children. The gate agent was worried about breaking rules that had gotten her colleagues fired in the past. Drawing on her own experience with the Lee family, Chen helped them find a solution that respected both the airline's needs and the family's situation. As they worked it out, she noticed other Pacific Air staff watching with curiosity. That evening, Chen modified her training program. Instead of trying to immediately change Pacific Air's culture, she would build bridges between the 2 airline staff. She created shadow days where Pacific Air employees could experience Sky Global's approach firsthand. The first success story came unexpectedly. A Pacific Air supervisor named Hui, known for his strict adherence to rules, spent a day observing Sky Global's operations during a weather delay. He watched in amazement as staff turned a frustrating situation into an opportunity for human connection. "I've been doing this wrong for 20 years, Hui confessed to Chen afterward. "I always thought being professional meant being detached. Today I saw that we can be both efficient and human." Hui became Chen's first advocate within Pacific Air. His transformation from skeptic to believer gave her program credibility among his colleagues. Slowly, more Pacific Air staff began volunteering for the training. But not everyone was convinced. A group of senior Pacific Air managers resisted the changes, arguing that their focus on efficiency was what kept planes running on time. They saw "human first" as a threat to their authority and way of working. The tension came to a head during a joint training session. A Pacific Air manager publicly challenged Chen, "This all sounds nice, but what happens when being human conflicts with being profitable?" Chen thought about her journey, from the flight attendant who almost lost her job to someone reshaping airline culture. "Let me tell you about the day I nearly kicked the owner of our airline off his own plane," she began. As she shared her story, she could see the resistance in the room softening. Many Pacific Air staff had similar experiences of making judgments based on appearances or rigid rules. Her vulnerability opened a door for them to share their own stories. Mr. Lee, who had been quietly observing these sessions, pulled Chen aside afterward. "You know what you're doing, right? You're not just teaching them to be kinder to passengers, you're helping them be kinder to themselves." The breakthrough came during another crisis. A Pacific Air flight and a Sky Global flight were both diverted to a small airport. While the Pacific Air staff initially fell back on their rigid procedures, they watched as Sky Global's team transformed the situation into an impromptu cultural exchange between passengers. By the end of the day, the two teams were working together, combining Pacific Air's efficient systems with Sky Global's human touch. Passengers from both flights commented on the exceptional service they received. Chen documented this spontaneous collaboration and used it to create a new training module called Best of Both Worlds. Instead of forcing Pacific Air staff to abandon their strengths, she showed them how to enhance their efficiency with empathy. As the integration progressed, something unexpected began to happen. Pacific Air's expertise in systems and procedures actually helped improve Sky Global's operations, while Sky Global's human-centered approach transformed Pacific Air's customer service. But even as Chen celebrated these successes, she knew the hardest part of the merger still lay ahead. 1 month before the final merger date, Chen sat in her office reviewing the latest feedback from Pacific Air's staff. The transformation had been remarkable, but one final challenge threatened to derail everything they'd built. Pacific Air's senior leadership had announced a controversial decision: they wanted to lay off 3,000 employees before the merger was complete. The news hit both airlines like a thunderbolt. All the trust Chen had carefully built between the two companies seemed to evaporate overnight. Pacific Air staff who had embraced "human first" now felt betrayed, seeing it as empty words in the face of corporate reality. "We can't let this happen," Chen told Mr. Lee during an emergency meeting. "These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, they're people with families, dreams, and years of dedication to their company." Mr. Lee looked tired, the weight of the decision visible on his face. "The board is concerned about redundancy. They say we can't maintain 2 people for every position." Chen spent the night at her desk, surrounded by employee files and performance reports. There had to be a solution that honored both business needs and human dignity. As dawn broke, she remembered something Mrs. Lee had once told her: sometimes the most human solution is also the most innovative one. With renewed determination, Chen developed what she called the Bridge Program. Instead of layoffs, she proposed a 2-year transition plan. Employees would be retrained for new roles created by the merger, from customer experience specialists to cultural integration coaches. "Give me 6 months," she pleaded with the board. "Let me show you how we can grow stronger by keeping our people." The presentation to the board was scheduled for the next day. As Chen prepared her materials, she received an unexpected visitor, Hui, the former Pacific Air supervisor who had become one of her strongest allies. "Our people are scared," he said. "But they're also ready to fight for their jobs. They want to tell their stories to the board." That night, Chen rewrote her entire presentation. Instead of charts and financial projections, she would let the employees speak for themselves. She worked with Hui to coordinate video testimonials from staff at both airlines. The next morning, the boardroom was tense as Chen began her presentation. "Before we discuss numbers," she said, I want you to meet the people behind them. The first video showed a Pacific Air ground crew member who had worked there for 25 years. He spoke about how the Human First training had helped him reconnect with his passion for helping people. His team had the highest customer satisfaction scores in the company's history. Next came a pair of flight attendants, one from each airline, who had developed a mentoring program for new hires, combining Pacific Air's technical expertise with Sky Global's human touch. Chen then unveiled her bridge program proposal. Instead of losing valuable experience, we create new opportunities. Every person we save from layoff becomes an ambassador for our united culture. The cost analysis showed that while the program required initial investment, it would save money long-term through reduced turnover and training costs. More importantly, it would preserve the trust and goodwill they'd built. Mr. Lee, who had been silent throughout the presentation, finally spoke. When Chen first made a mistake with my family on that flight, we could have fired her. Instead, we invested in her potential. Look at the return we got on that investment. The board debated for hours. Some members argued that the bridge program was too risky, too expensive. But Chen stood firm, supported by data showing how improved employee morale had directly impacted customer loyalty and revenue. Finally, the board agreed to a modified version of the program. While some positions would still be cut through voluntary retirement, the massive layoffs were cancelled. The money saved from redundancies would be invested in retraining and new position creation. The announcement was met with relief and celebration across both airlines. Chen watched as staff from both companies hugged each other, their previous divisions forgotten in the face of this shared victory. But implementing the bridge program proved to be an enormous challenge. Chen and her team worked around the clock, matching employees with new roles, designing training programs, and creating positions that hadn't existed before. One success story particularly touched her. A Pacific Air baggage handler, who'd been with the company for 30 years, discovered a talent for teaching during the Human First training. Under the bridge program, he became one of their most effective trainers, helping other employees adapt to the new culture. Mrs. Lee visited the training center during this transition period. "You know what you've really done here?" she asked Chen. "You've shown that being human isn't just about being kind, it's about being creative in how we solve problems." The media picked up on the story, praising Sky Global's innovative approach to the merger. Other airlines began reaching out, interested in learning about the bridge program and Human First training. But Chen's proudest moment came during a joint staff meeting. A Pacific Air employee stood up and said, "A year ago, I thought Sky Global was trying to destroy our way of working. Now I understand, they weren't asking us to change who we are, but to become more of who we could be." As Chen walked through the terminal that evening, she noticed something remarkable. Pacific Air and Sky Global staff were working together seamlessly, their different uniforms the only indication that they had ever been separate companies. A cleaning lady stopped her, the same one she'd helped months ago. "Miss Chen," she said with a smile, "my daughter just got accepted into the bridge program. She's going to be a customer service trainer." Chen hugged her, remembering her own journey from a mistake-making flight attendant to someone who had helped transform 2 airlines. But as she headed home, she knew there was still one final challenge ahead, perhaps the biggest one yet. 2 years after the merger, Chen stood in the gleaming atrium of Sky Global's new headquarters, watching employees stream in for a special announcement. The transformation was complete. Pacific Air's name and old uniforms were now part of aviation history, but its people had become integral to Sky Global's success. Today was particularly special. The airline was launching its most ambitious initiative yet, the Global Aviation Academy, a training center that would share the Human First philosophy with airlines worldwide. Chen had been chosen to lead it. As she prepared to address the gathered crowd, she spotted familiar faces. The Lee family sat in the front row, alongside Hui and many others who had been part of her journey. In the audience were representatives from 20 different airlines, all eager to learn about the program that had revolutionized air travel. 5 years ago, Chen began, I was a probationary flight attendant who almost lost her job because I judged a family by their appearance. Today, I'm here to tell you how that mistake changed not just my life, but the lives of thousands of airline employees and millions of passengers. The screens behind her displayed photos from the past few years, the emergency landing in Mumbai, the typhoon crisis, the merger celebration, and countless small moments of human connection that had become Sky Global's trademark. The airline industry has always focused on getting people from point A to point B, she continued. But we've proven that how we treat people along the way matters just as much as where we take them. The numbers backed up her words. Sky Global now had the highest customer satisfaction ratings in the industry. Employee turnover had dropped to record lows. The Bridge program had become a case study in business schools. Mr. Lee took the stage next. When we started this journey, people said we were being too soft, too idealistic. They said airlines couldn't afford to put people before procedures. We proved them wrong. Being human isn't just good for people, it's good for business. The announcement that followed stunned everyone. Sky Global would offer full scholarships to the Aviation Academy for employees from smaller airlines in developing countries. The goal was to spread the human-first philosophy to places where air travel was still seen as a luxury rather than a connection between people. As Chen toured the new academy facilities with the international delegates, she overheard conversations in dozens of languages, all centered on the same theme: how to bring humanity back to air travel. A young trainee from a small African airline approached her. In my country, many people save for years to take one flight. Now I understand, we're not just carrying passengers, we're carrying their dreams. The day's biggest surprise came during the closing ceremony. The Lee family called Chen to the stage one final time. 5 years ago, Mr. Lee announced, a flight attendant stopped us from boarding our own plane. Today, we're appointing that same flight attendant as Sky Global's new Chief People Officer. Chen's eyes filled with tears as Mrs. Lee handed her the official appointment letter. Remember, Mrs. Lee whispered, your mistake didn't define you, how you learned from it did. Later that evening, as the celebrations wound down, Chen found herself back in the terminal where it all began. A new flight attendant was helping an elderly couple who seemed confused about their gait. Chen watched as the young woman not only guided them but also arranged for a wheelchair and stayed with them until they were comfortable. I learned that from your training videos, the flight attendant told Chen when she noticed her watching. The one where you talked about looking for the invisible story. As Chen headed home, her phone buzzed with a message from Mr. Lee, ready for your first board meeting tomorrow? We're discussing expansion plans for the academy. She smiled, remembering how terrified she'd been of losing her job after that first encounter with the Lee family. Now she was helping to reshape the entire aviation industry. Passing through security, she noticed Ray, the same guard who used to watch her rush through during her flight attendant days. Look at you now, he beamed. From running late to running the show. You know what I learned, Ray, she replied. Sometimes being late, making mistakes, or having things go wrong, they're not obstacles. They're opportunities to show our humanity. That night, Chen stood at her apartment window, watching planes take off and land, just as she had done as a child. But now she saw them differently. Each set of lights in the sky represented not just an aircraft, but a vessel carrying hundreds of human stories, dreams, and connections. Her phone buzzed again, a photo from one of the international trainees at the academy. It showed a sunset view from a plane window with the caption, "First day implementing human-first training." A passenger was afraid of flying, so I showed her this view. She said it helped her see beauty instead of fear. Thank you for teaching us to see people, not just passengers. Chen saved the photo, knowing it would join the wall of memories in her new office. Her journey from that mistake on the Dubai flight had come full circle, but in many ways, it was just beginning. The real achievement wasn't in the program she'd created or the position she'd earned, it was in the thousands of small moments of human connection happening in airports and airplanes around the world. As she prepared for bed, she thought about all the flight attendants, ground staff, and airline employees who would start their shifts tomorrow. Thanks to one mistake and the grace of a family who saw potential instead of failure, they would all have a chance to make air travel a little more human. And somewhere in the night sky, a flight attendant was probably making the same mistake she once had, and learning, just as she did, that our greatest errors can lead to our greatest contributions, as long as we remember to put humans first.